Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of Ukrainian Orthodox Church media caught between Russia and Ukraine. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting the Kennan Institute's website and subscribing to our blogs and podcasts and other publications. I would also like to take a moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for its generous support of several of the Kennan Institute's fellowships. These fellowships allow us to support rising scholars, such as today's guest, Dr. Jacob Lassin. Dr. Jacob Lassin is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film, and a fellow with the Havinger Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Jacob's research interests are religion, politics, literature, and new media in Russia and the former Soviet Union. After our guest speaks, there will be a question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit your question via the Q&A function on Zoom, and please remember to include your name and affiliation when doing so. Finally, today's discussion is being recorded. Jacob, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I'm very excited to be here. Very grateful to the Kennan Institute and Title VIII for sponsoring my work, and especially the very productive summer I had this year. So if I can just, let's share my screen. Great. So today, I'd like to talk about Orthodox online media particularly. And Orthodox online media has been a key arena to understand how Russia's war against Ukraine affects the functioning of the Orthodox churches within both countries. And in this presentation, I'm going to be addressing online media specifically related to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as a way of better understanding the internal conflicts within that particular church and its strategies that it employs to connect with believers in Ukraine and abroad, and to maintain its position in a country that's grown rather hostile to it due to its affiliations with Russia. Now, due to the complicated theological situation in Ukraine and within the Orthodox Church globally, it's useful to take a moment here to distinguish the different organizations I'm going to be talking about for clarity. So I have this slide here that gives us some terms and acronyms that I'll be referring to throughout my presentation. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or the UOC, which I'll be focusing most on in this presentation, is the organization of the Russian Orthodox Church, or Moscow Patriarchate, that operates in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the OCU, or Orthodox Church of Ukraine, is a separate church that was granted autocephaly, that is, full ecclesial independence, by the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople in 2019. And so these two groups are not in communion with one another, and that's a very important distinction to make. So as I will demonstrate, I find that much of the UOC's media since the war began, and especially since May of 2022, works to portray the UOC as caught between Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church on the one hand, and the OCU and the Ukrainian government on the other hand, putting it into a difficult and increasingly untenable situation. And when looking at the online media of the UOC, one sees a definite attempt to distinguish itself from the ROC and make clear its disagreements with Patriarch Kirill within certain limits, while at the same time also making sure to stress its differences from the autocephalous OCU and Ecumenical Patriarchate, trying to stake out a position that results in a more muted approach in its media offerings than what we saw from before Russia's full-scale invasion. Now, May of 2022, a council of the UOC released new statutes that declared the full independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Moscow Patriarchate. This announcement led to many questions as to what asserting ecclesial independence meant in reality. Scholars such as Thomas Bremer have noted that the wording of the statement is rather clumsy and awkward, as its language does not really fit with established categories within Orthodox canon law. There's no real definition of what constitutes ecclesiastical independence, rather than well-used terms like autonomy and autocephaly. So the situation remains rather murky and confused. Finally, Because of the UOC's stark opposition to the ecumenical patriarchate's granting of autocephaly to the OCU, there was no mention, and very clearly no mention, of autocephaly in this document. So as another scholar, Pavlo Smitsynyuk, notes, this ambiguity exists as to whether or not the UOC has actually really broken ties with the Moscow Patriarchate, and what these outcomes of these actions will actually entail. So while the full details of these decisions are still being debated and worked out, we do see how they are affecting media narratives that emerge from sources affiliated with the UOC. So throughout my talk today, I'm going to address a few of these examples from different UOC-affiliated media outlets, as well as UOC engagement with outside media. I will show how it's trying to demonstrate its independence from the Moscow Patriarchate, while at the same time assert its own canonicity in keeping with the norms of Orthodox law as it contrasts itself with the OCU, which it sees as illegitimate. And in addition, I'll offer some comparisons to how these media strategies have shifted since February 2022. So I'm going to start with a website known as the Union of Orthodox Journalists, or the UOJ. And this is a UOC-affiliated outlet that was launched in the wake of the Euromaidan protests by Viktor Vishnevetsky, a Ukrainian billionaire with strong ties to the Moscow Patriarchate. Its main function has been to denigrate the idea of an autocephalous Ukrainian church and to document what its editorial staff sees as actions being taken against the Orthodox faith and believers in Ukraine, usually at the hands of those who support the OCU. It has often produced rather strident commentary against the OCU, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the governments of Ukraine and other Western countries. And I should note that the union mentioned in the name is itself a fiction. There is no actual union of Orthodox journalists here. Rather, it's an entirely astroturfed project that is meant to look like a kind of grassroots organic thing, but in reality is just set up by this one wealthy donor. So the UOJ provides an emblematic example of how online media affiliated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is attempting to strike a balance between disavowing Patriarch Kirill and his support for the war, while at the same time asserting that the creation of the OCU was non-canonical and needs to be opposed. So 2 articles from last year, published just a few days apart, demonstrate this process and the difficult position that the UOC is in trying to distinguish its position in a Ukrainian media space. So here we see one headline that reads, "Roundtable against the UOC, do they want to return to Poroshenko times?" And a second one that reads, "The ROC, the state, and war. What would Metropolitan Kirill say to Patriarch Kirill?" And so these 2 headlines offer a glimpse into the divided sentiment. So the first article highlights a roundtable discussion that took place in Kyiv concerning the role of the Moscow Patriarchate in the war against Ukraine and its influence and control over the UOC. This article on the UOJ, unsurprisingly, finds this discussion, this roundtable, objectionable. And the author writes that he puts the words roundtable in quotation marks throughout the article because he felt it did not rise to the proper definition of a roundtable, where, quote, "supporters of various points of view are invited to discuss the matters at hand in a respectful manner," end quote. Instead, the author makes a point that everyone involved was of the same opinion regarding the ROC and the UOC. He also notes that the UOJ attempted to participate in the event, but were turned away for what was called their own political bias towards the UOC. Included at the beginning of this article was a screenshot from the roundtable of an illustration depicting Patriarch Kirill as an octopus, whose tentacles are wrapped tightly around a cathedral that represents the UOC. In placing this illustration in the article, the author offers a visual encapsulation of what he views as the roundtable's wholesale discrediting of the UOC, its alleged predetermined biases against it, as well as an inextricable link between the UOC and Patriarch Kirill with the Russian state. Throughout the article, the comments of the participants are noted as being from certain experts, again written all in quotation marks. As a means of discrediting the notion that they are experts at all on the issues at hand. The author decries the expertise of the participants by noting their ignorance of the structure of the UOC and their misunderstandings of Orthodox theology. He especially takes issue with the idea that the whole of the UOC should be held responsible as collaborators with the Russian government, and that the notion that's presented at the roundtable that the UOC is in schism from all other Orthodox churches. So in reciting these perceived mistakes, the author helps to develop the narrative that the UOC is being maligned and treated unfairly by people who do not understand all of the details and nuances of the situation. Now, the fact that this roundtable occurred without the participation of the UOC, and that its only chances to respond came from their own media outlets, demonstrates the great difficulty that the UOC has in being able to stake its own position in Ukrainian public discourse. Even though, as the author argues, the Ukrainian war dead are commemorated daily in the churches of the UOC, and UOC parishes organize humanitarian aid for Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, this is not enough in the eyes of the roundtable organizers to make up for the fact that the UOC does not recognize the OCU's autocephaly and its associations with the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, the second article takes a very different approach, and this is a full-scale repudiation of Patriarch Kirill's actions with regard to the war in Ukraine, and Patriarch Kirill is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. The article provides a thorough reading of past writings by Kirill from when he was a metropolitan of the church before he became patriarch, related to the questions of war, and as well as his involvement in the drafting of the very important document, The Social Bases of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is basically a social policies and guidelines for the Russian Orthodox Church that it supports and promotes. The article starts with detailing a detailed listing of the facts surrounding the war. Most importantly, that it was started by Russia, that it's taking place on Ukraine's territory, that the war was entirely unprovoked, and that the civilian population of Ukraine is suffering immensely because of this war. This listing of a litany of details works to ensure that any reader understands that the UOJ does not agree with Russian justifications for the war at all. Moreover, the UOJ works to demonstrate the independence of the UOC through the use of Kirill's previous statements and positions concerning the war and violence. The strategy appears as a way to try and salvage its reputation and to distinguish itself again from the Russian Orthodox Church in the standing of Ukrainians generally. Now, the article concludes with a very interesting detail. The author provides an excerpt from an email he claims to have received from an Orthodox Christian in Russia. It reads, and here's the Russian I have for you. I've encountered a difficult situation. Our patriarch justifies the war and calls to kill Ukrainians. But at services, we commemorate his name, as well as that of our bishop, who supported all of these ideas and even traveled to occupied Donetsk and Luhansk. My priest confessor also supports all these atrocities. What should I do? My moral and ethical guidelines do not agree with these positions. Because of this, I don't want to go to church. Is it necessary to go to liturgy performed by clergy who justify murders? The language here is extremely powerful and offers a forceful disavowal of the Moscow Patriarchate. Interestingly, the article does not offer answers to the reader's questions. To do so, to tell a reader whether or not to attend liturgies presided by these clergy would perhaps be a step too far, given its role and affiliations with the UOC. But the author does use this as an example to make clear that there's a growing issue within the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that must be addressed, lest it lead to much greater divisions and conflicts. So using the words of this Russian Orthodox Christian, help to demonstrate the problems that are happening at the ground level within both churches. Now, you may have noticed when I showed these two headlines that the design of the website looks rather different. And that's because there was a website refresh that happened between when they were initially published and when I took the screenshots. What also happened was that this article in particular, the one that was critical of Patriarch Kirill, was taken down. It was deemed to be a bit too extreme in its criticisms. So now when you go to look for it, this is what you receive. A page not found notice. So there are still, even if they're trying to offer a separation from the Russian Orthodox Church, there are certain things that cannot be said, certain criticisms that cannot be made. So moving on from the Union of Orthodox Journalists, I'd like to now shift to a YouTube channel called Vitra. And Vitra is the Russian word for stained glass windows. So Vitra was founded by a man named Denis Lassin and appears to be sponsored at least in part by the UOC. It shares an email address with another UOC affiliated online outlet, for example. So before the 2022 invasion, the videos on Vitra were all about church-related topics, and they would take complex theological and ecclesiastical issues and make them more digestible for a wide audience. And these videos were, had a high production value. They were often very informative. They could be very entertaining. And they were kind of the perfect vehicle to reach audiences that are not as familiar with church history and not well versed in kind of all the nuances and details of orthodoxy. To reach wider audiences and to keep their attention, his videos were often on topics that appeared rather salacious or controversial. And he would often present them in a rather confrontational tone. In addition, the thumbnail previews of the videos and the images he would use throughout were themselves often very provocative and worked to capitalize on various meme formats seen throughout the internet. So to take one example from a video that insinuated that the US State Department was behind the granting of autocephaly to the OCU due to Joe Biden's political debt to the Greek American community of Delaware, we see the employment of an image that doctors a kind of well passed around image of Joe Biden squeezing the shoulders of Ash Carter, the former Secretary of Defense's wife, Stephanie Carter. So here's the image that Vitra posted. Obviously, it's of a very suggestive nature. So here we see, and this is the original image that it's riffing on. So here we see that Stephanie Carter has been replaced with Patriarch Bartholomew of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. On his clerical hat, it reads Prosta Druk, which is Russian for just a friend, thereby injecting a lot of homophobic kind of undertones into this as well. And it offers a visual representation of the so-called intimacy that Lassin references between the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the US government. Along with these homophobic overtones, it also is meant to kind of invoke ideas of the libertine values that Russian language media often accuses the US and the West of exporting to Ukraine and Russia. So this sort of provocation was very, very common in the videos that Lassin produced prior to the full-scale invasion. However, in the months since May of last year, Lassin's presence in the videos of Vitra has been much more limited. He's almost never in any videos anymore. The videos that the channel now posts are almost exclusively limited to short exegeses on daily gospel topics and readings, and are hosted by Metropolitan Antoni Pankanic. The much more sedate tone and content of these videos demonstrates a shift in the UOC's media strategy, a less desire and willingness to be confrontational with supporters of the OCU and their online media. Now, moving on to a different media source, one that's outside of the realm of the UOC, I'd like to turn to some posts on the blog Public Orthodoxy, written by Bishop Sylvester Stoichev of Belgorod, who is the head of the Kiev Theological Academy. So in these two posts from last year, he writes about kind of the outcomes and the issues associated with trying to declare independence from the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, the fact that he's posting on Public Orthodoxy is itself kind of surprising. The blog is well known among scholars who work on topics related to Orthodoxy around the world, and it's affiliated with the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University, which among some people, especially within the Orthodox world, could be construed as advocating a progressive stance on theological and ecclesiological issues. Now, Bishop Sylvester surely understands these connotations and clearly wants to address this audience, specifically to help clarify the position of the UOC and help to elicit some support from those who might have been antagonistic toward it in the past due to its affiliations with the Russian Orthodox Church. So in his posts, Bishop Sylvester notes that the opponents of the UOC reacted to the idea of this Declaration of Independence, that it was only claiming independence from Moscow. He goes on to note that while these criticisms were largely based on what he sees as prejudices against the Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Orthodox churches, he does note that there is one question that these critics do raise that's important to clarify: the current canonical status of the UOC. And he reiterates that there was no declaration of autocephaly. And he concedes that it's a difficult issue, and he doesn't believe it's going to be resolved soon. And in his estimation, it can only be dealt with at the level of a pan-Orthodox council. This is when all of the Orthodox churches around the world get together to make decisions. And so Bishop Sylvester goes on to speak against, quote, Patriarch Bartholomew's unilateral attempt to solve this question essentially ended up as a failure. And here he's referring to the granting of autocephaly to the OCU. As the question, returning to his words, as the question was not solved, but became even more tangled. The Council of May 27th means to me an important declaration and point of departure for the future. It is commendable that the UOC restrained itself from so reckless a step as to unilaterally declaring autocephaly. This would have been a step into nowhere, end quote. So Bishop Sylvester uses this moment to assert the correctness of the UOC's decisions and actions in this delicate matter, ones that he sees as based in the canons of the church and exhibiting the virtues of prudence. In doing so, he offers criticism of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and its role in the ecclesiastical debates within Ukraine, echoing the prevailing lines from the ROC and the UOC that the Ecumenical Patriarchate should not be meddling in Ukrainian affairs at all. But I find that Bishop Sylvester's response results in ever more ambiguity. If the UOC has not declared autocephaly and thinks doing so would be a mistake, but at the same time is now independent from Moscow and is no longer commemorating Patriarch Kirill in its liturgies, then where does that leave the UOC? Simply noting that the situation is complex does not provide a satisfactory answer to the status of the UOC today and its place within the global Eastern Orthodox communion. Why then write these posts? I contend that Bishop Sylvester did this to demonstrate an openness to dialogue and a willingness to engage with audiences he knows have not always agreed with the positions of the UOC. By going to a forum like Public Orthodoxy, Bishop Sylvester displays an understanding of the central role that media plays in how the disputes within Ukrainian Orthodoxy are framed and received. He knows that it is essential for the UOC to be able to state its case and try to actually convince people through the media, both in Ukraine and abroad. And finally, I'd like to turn attention to one last online resource. This one is coming from within the UOC again. And it has a much more ecumenical approach than what we've seen previously. So this project is called Dialog.TUT, or Dialogue Here in Ukrainian. This was an initiative of Archbishop Yona Cherepanov, one of the vicariate archbishops of Kyiv, within the UOC. Archbishop Yona has a long-standing interest in outreach, especially with youth. He has been the editor of a magazine and website aimed at teenagers called Dialog.TUT, which is just teenager.ua. And as this project's name implies, its goal is to bring people together for discussion, to address the issues that are dividing Ukrainian society, especially within the church. Russia's full-scale invasion was the impetus behind its creation in April of 2022. And unlike other Orthodox online projects, Dialog.TUT is unique in that it does not have separate language editions depending on one's preferences. So the UOJ, like I showed you before, has separate Russian and Ukrainian language versions, for example, along with other languages. Rather, on Dialog.TUT, Russian and Ukrainian are presented side by side, with select articles being presented in both. And the decision, I find, is a gesture towards coexistence and attempts to make claims that Ukrainian culture and identity is present, accepted, and celebrated within the UOC, which has been a criticism against it from outside. Moreover, this decision also tries to show greater separation from Moscow. Now, this attempted separation is reinforced in the project's About Us page. The page is only available in Ukrainian, a move that is clearly used to label the project as one that's free from Russian interference. And on this page, the project declares that it is independent and praises how, quote, our church, side by side with Ukraine, bears the burden of this terrible war that has affected every family, every city, every home, end quote. And this is, again, an instantiation of a desire to show the UOC as on the side of Ukraine. Now, this assertion of independence is not always readily accepted by those outside of the UOC. On the project's Facebook page, for example, a recent negative review of Dialog.TUT from a user named Sasha Antonyuk writes, and it's the top one here, independent, 4 clown face emojis. No, it's a dependent project from the ROC KGB, or FSB, in Ukraine. This scathing attack invokes a number of issues that online projects associated with the UOC face in the current moment. Perhaps the most pertinent of these is the difficulty of convincing people of the UOC's independence, as was seen above. The Russian Orthodox Church, and by extension the UOC, sees deep connections with the Russian state, allow for Antonyuk to launch his view of a link between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Russian state security services. The content on the pages of Dialog.TUT in some ways is similar to what we saw in the UOJ, advocating for the independence of the UOC while at the same time supporting its canonicity and kind of denigrating the issue of autocephaly. So to take one example, we see an article that aims to answer 12 of the common myths about the creation of the OCU and the relationship between the UOC, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Russian state. So this myth that you see here, myth number 6, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is the church of the KGB, is one of the myths it's answering. These myths are answered in the form of YouTube videos, roughly 5 minutes in length, that aim to provide succinct theological and ecclesiological answers to the various questions, and offer a counter discourse to the notion that the UOC is merely a branch or a pawn of the Moscow Patriarchate. These videos are clearly pitched towards a Ukrainian and international audience. The presenter speaks in Ukrainian and his words are accompanied by English subtitles. These choices demonstrate an attempt to influence audiences who are most likely to have skepticism towards the UOC, and it's due to its associations with Russia. All the videos stress the independence of the UOC and its ability to make decisions for itself. Moreover, the decision to make this a series of YouTube videos rather than just text is an indication of an understanding of the younger audience's preferences for content consumption and trying to garner greater audiences and engagement online. One other example I want to draw our attention to is this article. In our church, we have made the decision to commemorate the patriarch. So the title of this article references the controversy within the UOC over whether or not to commemorate Patriarch Kirill in its liturgy. And the commemoration of a bishop and a patriarch is a kind of integral part of Orthodox liturgical practices. And within Ukraine, it's become a flashpoint over the UOC's relationship with the Moscow Patriarchate, with people arguing that if you commemorate Kirill, then you're commemorating someone who is sanctioning this war. So officially, the UOC has instructed priests to no longer commemorate the patriarch. But as this article demonstrates, this is not being followed by all UOC priests. So the priest interviewed in this article, and it's important to note that he is unnamed and it's not even listed which city he works in, offers his reasoning for why he still commemorates Patriarch Kirill. He notes that soon after the war began, he had a meeting with parishioners who were vehement that he stopped commemorating Kirill because of his support for war. And the unnamed priest asks his parishioners for proof as to Kirill's support for the war. They offer the example that he blessed an icon that was given to soldiers. And the priest responds that this is normal pastoral activity, and that Kirill was merely acting in his role as a spiritual leader. Moreover, he counters that the patriarch has called for prayers for peace in Ukraine to be said daily at all churches within Russia. And here, a rather interesting addition is appended to the article, as it includes an editor's note that mentions that this prayer for peace has been replaced with a prayer for Holy Rus, and that any mention of Ukraine from the prayer has been eliminated. So this demonstrates that even while trying to put forward the best face of those who still support Patriarch Kirill and trying to kind of engage in this dialogue and discussion, that the realities make it such that the militaristic bent of the Russian Orthodox Church have to be presented and kind of counter the arguments being made in this more ecumenical space. Now, the priest emphasizes that he views commemorating Kirill as part of his duties as an Orthodox priest, and he'll continue to do so indefinitely unless Kirill engages in schism or preaches heresy. Now, to take such a strong line on this issue, one that is counter to his own bishop's instructions, demonstrates the importance that this priest ascribes to his actions. And moreover, it highlights the difficulty that the UOC has in being able to make a real clean break between itself and Moscow. Dialog.TUT does a service in presenting an actual controversy and noting that not everyone is in agreement regarding the directions and decisions of the UOC. As a project that's designed to allow for dialogue and discussion of difficult issues, as well as to enhance the UOC's image as a place open to conversation and not beholden to Moscow, this article, though, seems to undercut this strategy, as it presents a recalcitrant element within the UOC that does not want to make any compromises. So in sum, I find that the online media that the UOC produces demonstrates the precarious situation of this church in Ukraine today. The attempt to both show a patriotic side and support its flock in a time of great violence, crisis, and unrest motivates its need to distance itself from Moscow. At the same time, relations with the OCU remain strained at best, and the majority of those within power within the UOC do not see the OCU's autocephaly as legitimate and are still, quite disgruntled by the greater support that the OCU has received from the Ukrainian state, whereas the Ukrainian state has been rather antagonistic, especially in their eyes, to the UOC. What results when we look at the online media is a need for the UOC to justify itself to these various sides, none of which are generally favorable towards it, or convinced of its separation from Moscow. And so what I hope I've shown here are that the attempts of the UOC is making to carve out this space and communicate its position. However, whether this approach will be convincing to Ukrainians and audiences abroad still remains to be seen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jacob. That was fascinating, and it's such a complex issue, Orthodoxy, and you did such a good job laying out the different layers and the different intricacies. That was fantastic. I want to open the floor for questions now, so I'll remind, while questions are starting to come in from the audience, remind everyone to please submit your questions, including your name and affiliation, and you can do so via the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So while we're starting to get a couple questions coming in, maybe I'll start, Jacob, and ask you one or two questions. So first, it's just fascinating to me. Again, you gave, if I counted correctly, 4 different examples. The Union Orthodox Journalists, Public Orthodoxy, Vitra and Dialog.TUT. And I'm curious, can you speak a little bit more? You did towards the end with Dialog.TUT about the audience that they're trying to reach, right? When you said, like they're using YouTube videos, which they're obviously trying to reach younger audience. With these 4 other examples you've looked at, I guess, who is the intended audience? And then beyond that, is that audience actually able to affect any change? I mean, do you see them actually taking that information and doing anything with it? So that would be my first question for you.
Yeah, it's really, really important question. So for the UOJ and Vitra, well, Vitra, I think, has a similar audience to Dialog.TUT, actually, in that it should, it skews younger. It's trying to get people who are maybe not as fully engaged in church life, but that, know that it's important, and trying to give them information about it that is more digestible and kind of more exciting than maybe what they've seen from other, more staid institutions. The UOJ, I think, has a slightly older audience, but for that, it's more, I think, people who are pretty well steeped in church life, honestly. So it's really about kind of holding on to that audience to make sure that, I guess, people don't go over to the OCU, that they decide to stay within the UOC and kind of understand what the quote unquote party line is on that. And then finally, with public orthodoxy, public orthodoxy's audience is people like me, right? It's scholars who work on orthodoxy. I've written for public orthodoxy before, for example. And as for like affecting change, I think what Archbishop Sylvester is trying to do there, right, is to engage with people who do write about orthodoxy a lot and talk about orthodoxy, and could maybe shift public narratives about how we think about the UOC, and maybe not giving it such a black and white, this is Moscow affiliated, this is not Moscow affiliated. That's where I think they could perhaps affect change. As for the other three, like I mentioned with the UOJ, I think their audience, the most important thing is kind of holding on to people, getting information out that they want out. And the other two, it's about engaging youth and trying to get a new generation, one that might be unsure about what church to go to or to go to church at all, about kind of the reasons why the UOC is maybe the proper choice.
Great. No, thank you very much. We've got a number of questions coming in. So I'll start with the first one from Hiroki Nakanishi, asking, I'd like to facilitate exports of Ukrainian wheats stored in a Romanian port currently to Japan. The question is, what is the current state of play of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on a war in Ukraine, relationship with the Russian, Romanian, other Orthodox churches in Eastern, Southern, and Crimean regions?
Yeah, really, really interesting question. So the whole question of autocephaly has been a very difficult one for the other Orthodox churches around the world to parse through, about whether or not they would recognize the autocephaly. And a lot of what's happened, a lot of people have seen a kind of, or have talked about a kind of break between a kind of Slavic world versus Greek world has been one kind of breakdown of it. But that's not a perfect way of thinking about this at all. It's not necessarily true that all Greek-speaking churches recognize and all non-Greek-speaking churches don't. So it's very complicated, and it has to do with the relationships between, for example, these various countries' governments and Russia, as well as the Orthodox churches, as in addition to other, issues that these churches have had with one another over territory, over who is in charge of what regions, what churches, all that sort of information. And so it's a really ongoing problem that is causing greater discord within the larger Orthodox communion.
Great, thank you. Next question from Greg. Greg Yost. Almost 10% of Ukrainians are Byzantine Catholic, mostly in Western areas. Do the ROC and or the UOC-MP and or the UOJ try to link the OCU or even the EP to Byzantine Catholics or to, quote, Rome, the Western churches, or generally, quote, European-led organizations? That's a great question. Maybe just first, for those who aren't steeped in Orthodoxy, go back through so people are clear on what ROC and UOJ and all of that is. But great question.
Yeah, Greg, absolutely, you're dead on. So within Ukraine, there, in addition to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, there is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is a full part of the worldwide Catholic Church. The major difference is that their services, their way of worship, their liturgical styles, all that stuff looks very much like Orthodoxy, and it was formed in this kind of theological union as a way to get people who were used to a kind of Eastern Christian approach to worship and theology, but to have them in communion with Rome. So, Greg, you're absolutely right. These Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated media always are tying things to the West and to the Catholic Church. I actually have a book chapter coming out in an edited volume probably next year, all about the kind of what they accuse the Ecumenical Patriarchate of doing, what they call Eastern Papism, basically trying to become a pope of Orthodoxy, trying to move Orthodoxy more into line with a model of the West, and with that, bringing Western values, which involve LGBTQ acceptance, greater participation of women, for example, in liturgy, those sorts of things. So there is very much this drive to kind of tie the Catholic Church and the West to the OCU and the granting of autocephaly. And a lot of times they kind of try to frame it as a step on the road towards union with Rome.
Excellent. Next question from Alex Bennett. Does the OCU, or Orthodox Church of Ukraine, provide any military chaplains to the armed forces of Ukraine?
Yes, it does.
Great. Next question, Alexander Patico. Clearly, there are pragmatic and political issues that would dictate that the UOC would attempt to distance itself from Kirill, Russia, Putin, and that the ecclesial aspects of the situation are extremely murky. My question, are there any truly theological questions that come into play?
So the theological question over canonicity, as in, is this church's structure and declaration of autocephaly legitimate, is a very important theological question, because to not be in communion with the Orthodox Church means that, the sacraments are not effective. They're not, you're not part of the larger body of the church. And so, this is a major theological question. It might seem like a bureaucratic one or just kind of an organizational question, but at its heart, it is a theological issue that that lots of people obviously feel very strongly about, and it's very difficult to kind of parse through. And so, the issues that we get into here about who has that authority to grant autocephaly and who has the authority over Ukraine as a territory are other theological issues that are motivating all of this.
No, thank you. We've got a question now. This great ties back to our earlier discussion kind of on the Catholic Church. Kathy Wanner at Penn State University. What role do you think religious minorities might play in resolving the impasse between Orthodox churches in Ukraine?
Excellent question, Kathy. That's a difficult one for me to answer. I'm really not sure. So on the one hand, I don't think much, honestly, because I don't think that there's much interest in kind of listening to outside points of view, especially from the UOC-ROC side. Because of the really strong stance that the UOC and the ROC has taken against ecumenism, I think if you then leave Christian faiths after that or get into Protestantism, it's very, very difficult to, get credence with, have people really listen to those issues from those sides, because people have been so kind of conditioned within these institutions that, we don't engage with that isn't part of the faith anymore.
Great. Next question from Alex Bennett. How do you see any future dialogue between the OCU and the UOC in a, quote, reunion, or do you see the OCU diminishing as the war continues?
I don't see the OCU as diminishing. I think if anything, it's probably being strengthened as people try to, as people take a more kind of patriotic stance, right? This is seen as the national church now for a lot of people. So that's a huge benefit to it, I think, in being able to kind of establish itself, because it is, still in its very nascent stages. As for kind of reunion, I think that's what a lot of people hope for. It's just very difficult at this stage, especially with so many kind of high emotions and conflicts, especially over that autocephaly question, that I really do not see any kind of union between them on the horizon.
Great. Next question from Anna Leava. Could you speak a little about Georgian Church's position on the separation of Ukrainian Orthodox Church? And
Oh,
actually, I'll add on to that too, because it's a great question. And I was curious too, are you seeing any ripple effects from this in the other countries that are Orthodox majority, or does this seem to be a unique situation to Ukraine?
so Georgia, is in a kind of difficult situation, right? Because 20% of Georgian territory is under Russian occupation right now. And so I'm not aware of whether they've recognized the autocephaly or not. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, these difficulties, because on the one hand, right, there is worry that in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that those churches could then be recognized and become kind of autocephalous, right? That would take away from the Georgian Orthodox Church's influence and kind of territory. So that's one issue that is iffy. So that would be probably why they wouldn't want to accept autocephaly. At the same time, though, speaking of other Orthodox churches, the Serbian Orthodox Church, which many people see as kind of Moscow Patriarchate's biggest defender, biggest kind of ally within the global communion, has actually recognized autocephaly of a group that they had considered a breakaway, the Macedonian Orthodox Church. And this happened after the OCU was recognized. So it's interesting that even in the face of all of this, and you would think that maybe Serbia, in kind of mirroring Moscow, would dig its heels in even more and not want to recognize what they see as a breakaway group, has actually gone the opposite direction and has looked towards reconciliation and being able to grant autocephaly to the Macedonian Orthodox Church.
That case is fascinating, the Serbian one you just brought up. Wow. Next question from Anatoly Babinski. Looking through the news on all these websites, have you noticed any changes in the use of terms such as Rus or Holy Rus, which have become tools of Russian propaganda? Yes. Sorry, I forgot to read his affiliation. Postdoc at Notre Dame.
Yeah, Anatoly, they've used. I mean, it's everywhere now. Rus is very, very, very much kind of the go-to historical touchstone, and this idea, right, that we're drawing from basically the medieval period, the very adoption of Christianity in the Eastern Slavic lands, and that and the holiness of the land in particular being recognized. So it is very much kind of inculcated with their larger kind of discourse.
Great. Next question from Diane Kirby, Blackfriars OUP. What sort of relationship does the Ecumenical Patriarch actually have with U.S. leaders and policymakers, if any?
Yeah, it's a great question. So now, yeah, if you listen to the UOJ, right, the Ecumenical Patriarchate basically has a direct line to the State Department and can control all this policy. But in reality, where its actual influence and importance is that the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America is directly under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So he chooses the Archbishop for the US. So that's kind of the biggest major influence there. And the fact that a lot of wealthy donors to the Ecumenical Patriarchate live in the United States, for example. And so there's some connections, but it's not like, again, not some kind of like secretive cabal that is running things behind the scenes politically.
Great. Next question from Duncan Whittam. Could you comment on the control of the Orthodox real estate in Ukraine? My understanding is that most of the churches are still under control of the UOC. Who controls the ecclesiastical property? Great question.
Yeah. In a lot of cases, these fights are real estate battles. It's probably the biggest issue. And real estate battles, not only just because of like the monetary value, but because of the historical and spiritual value associated with various shrines, saints like relics, all that sort of stuff. So probably the biggest examples I can think of on the UOJ site, you'll see basically once a week at least an article all about the kind of what they call the capturing of another UOC parish by OCU supporters. And so, all about these fights between a parish priest who's siding with one side a community that's siding with another, and this fight over the literal property. You'll also, the other big issue to consider is the Kievo-Pecherska Lavra. So this is the most important monastery within Ukrainian Orthodoxy, certainly, and I would say Russian Orthodoxy probably as well, or at least one of the most important. And basically, it's a very complicated question because when the Ukrainian state became independent in the 90s, that site was basically made into a national landmark, a national museum, with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church being granted use of a lot of the buildings, or most of the buildings, with, from what I understand, a basically $0 lease that was granted to them. Well, since the war began, the government's rethought those relationships and that way of allowing them to use the building. There have been various investigations and what's the word I'm looking for? When officials come into a place and look through stuff. Well, they've gone through and looked for things, and they've found various raids. Thank you, raids that have discovered things like extra passports for some of the bishops and priests there, lots of cash, all sorts of stuff that might indicate collaboration or cooperation with Russian government officials. Meanwhile, on the Ukrainian Orthodox side, right, they take this as a huge affront that you're going to kick out a bunch of seminarians from their school, that you're going to force all these poor bishops and priests and monks and nuns out of their homes, and that you're making this all political when they're just people of God. So that's a huge kind of real estate issue, but that obviously has much larger political ramifications.
Great. Question from, so I got a number of questions coming in here from Geraldine Fagan of the East-West Church Report. Why did you choose the particular Ukrainian examples? The Vitra video still only has 2,000 views, and the Dialog.TUT article is about the only one I've seen of probably hundreds of theirs that presents the view of a UOC priest still commemorating Kirill.
Yeah, so well, with the Dialog.TUT article, I wanted to include that to kind of show the two sides, right? That there is some kind of, that it does actually have dialogue, right? That it's not just one-sided, that there is, both trying to deal with these myths and trying to kind of show that the UOC is separate, but at the same time showing that there is perhaps a, there is an element that doesn't want to break with Moscow, and that it's very, that there is a controversy there, that it isn't as clear cut, and that, even if they want to present it that way, it's very difficult to make that separation. As for Vitra, I wanted to show the before and after to you guys of what Orthodox Church media looked like prior to the invasion, how the UOC was talking about these issues, was presenting its side of the story, how it was trying to engage audiences, and how radically it changed. And that's why I wanted to kind of share those examples.
Great. Question from Per Gustafsson Korki in the Swedish Defense Research Agency. Could you say something about, or say something on the OUC's position on the war?
Yeah, this is our problem with the acronym. So I think you mean OCU.
Yeah, so, OCUs, yeah.
So the Autocephalous Church in Ukraine. They are 100%, behind the Ukrainian state and against the war, and see it as an invasion and see it as a infringement onto Ukrainian national identity and an attempt by Russia to basically destroy the Ukrainian nation. So in that sense, they have a very easy position. They're kind of built for this, really, of being able to kind of support Ukraine and to be seen as the kind of national church, like I was saying.
Great. Question from Kathleen Smith at Smithsonian Air and Space. I understand that you are focusing on the online representation of the schism, but do you find any indication that it appears downstream at the pastoral level?
So like those, that's a great question, Kathleen. So like I was mentioning with those articles about the capturing the zakvat of various parishes, that's where I see it kind of filtering down of when it starts affecting people's local communities. Of, it does the church that I've always gone to, is that now OCU? Is it UOC? I'm not sure. Like which one am I supposed to go to? That's where I'm seeing the kind of on the ground level pastoral issue of the schism. And that's another reason why I wanted to highlight that article with the priest saying why he's commemorating Kirill, to show the kind of pastoral level about like how various places are trying to deal with these questions.
Great. Question from Hiroki Nakanishi. How can Ukrainian Orthodox churches influence Russian Orthodox churches to stop the war, and give this offer from Russia? I think is there any way for those that have separated themselves in Ukraine to somehow influence the Orthodox churches in Russia?
Yeah, I mean, the I don't know about in Ukraine to influence Russia. I think that's pretty difficult because the UOC has done basically its most extreme, I think, probably attempt, right, of being able to separate itself, of trying to declare this independence short of autocephaly, and it hasn't really done anything to change any kind of Russian Orthodox Church policies, or certainly no Russian state policies. Now, if the Russian Orthodox Church itself were to start opposing and to actually taking a strong stance, I think maybe that could have an influence, or at least it could help create greater discord in Russia that would make it much more difficult for the state to implement its policies with regard to the war in Ukraine.
Great. And there's another person's question kind of builds on that. Alexander Patico, are there any significant differences between the way the UOC and the OCU relate to the Ukrainian war effort and the way that Kirill and other Moscow Patriarchate figures relate to the Russian war effort? Is either noticeably less or more tied to the war-making endeavor?
So, yeah, it's mostly a difference in the, a defensive versus offensive stance. So, with the both churches in Ukraine that are very much kind of supporting the Ukrainian war effort, it's more about kind of support and offering aid, humanitarian issues, chaplaincy, those sorts of things. Whereas from the Russian side, the way that the relationship to the war making effort seems to be, right, is some of that issue over blessing icons given to soldiers, right? Or giving speeches like Patriarch Kirill did very soon after the war began, that basically said that Russia was justified and had to move into Eastern Ukraine because of things like the granting of autocephaly and the kind of greater Western orientation of the Ukrainian government that would bring, Western libertine values like gay pride parades, for example, to Ukraine. So it's very much kind of the building a justification side from Russia versus kind of the support side with Ukrainian churches.
That's great. It's fascinating. And we are getting down close to time. We're at about the last minute or two. Maybe just one final question for you, Jacob, related again to audiences and who these are targeting. I'm curious if you've done any looking at, the Russians who've left either after February of last year or September of last year. And are they tapping into, Russians or Ukrainians, actually taking both categories. Those that have left or moved right out of the area since the war, are they also still following what's going on with the churches, or no? Do you see that this is more of an issue for those people who are still in Ukraine or Russia?
I think people definitely, like diaspora Ukrainians especially, very, very acute issue. And especially, in already existing church communities that had ties to various of these institutions, about kind of do they want to separate themselves more if say a bishop took a more pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian side, something like that. So there definitely is people keeping up with this, And we see it also affecting kind of long-established Russian Orthodox communities in Europe, for example, in the US, that either are no longer considering themselves part of the Moscow Patriarchate, or have made comments that say like, "Oh no, we're 100% behind this, and we want to, we stand by kind of our patriarch." So there's definitely a big issue for kind of the global Orthodox world, especially those with ties to Russia or Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Jacob. We are, and based on the comments, a lot of people who ask questions are ready, and also thanking you for your excellent way of answering the questions. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation and question and answer. And thank you to all of our audience members for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you all very much.